Now, in the early days, the main focus of disability policy was on providing vocational rehabilitation services to injured veterans. And we can see that in the first piece of legislation that was written, which is the Smith-Fest Act of 1920, or also known as the Civilian Vocational Rehabilitation Act. This provided and implemented therapeutic, rehabilitation, medical and prosthesis, and other such services through the Veterans Affairs for the new influx of wounded veterans coming back from the foreign wars. Now, this was probably due to increases in, not only regular medicine, but battlefield medicine, that we saw a much more wide array of injuries from the battlefront that were then able to be survivable, in which case we needed to be able to retrain these soldiers so that they could have a productive and proactive life after their service. And we can see just how much wartime really did play a role in this act, looking at the 3 revision dates, which is in the middle of World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, respectively. We can see that, the American people, even in the height of a lot of racial tension in the civil rights movement, Americans were aware that we had a lot of new veterans coming back with a lot of different problems, and we needed to do something to serve them after they gave so much for us. So in a time of I guess some people could consider social backwardsness, this was a very progressive thing that was happening. And along the notes of the Civil Rights Act, while it didn't directly influence any legislation on disability policy, it did state a legal precedent, whereas it created a minority. It had the idea of minorities being a protected class, and protected class meaning that a specific group of people had a specific group of rights that were theirs, which is special to them, as opposed to the population at large. Now, they can carry over. A lot of anti-discrimination legislation carries over across demographics, but it is the demographics themselves that are protected, such as certain minority classes, sexual orientations, and people with disabilities. Now, the first big piece of modern legislation we saw was the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and this was really groundbreaking legislation at the time, because this was the first designation of a disability as protected class. Therefore, before then, disabled people did not have any certain special anti-discrimination rights set out in stone in federal law for them up until this point. Now, this law is broken down into several sections, but a few of the most important ones pertaining to adult education are sections 501 and 503, which is affirmative action and non-discrimination in employment, and this has to do with agencies receiving federal funding. Now, this includes colleges and universities, it includes civil service agencies, school corporations, so on and so forth. Anyone that's getting money from the government and has to comply to this non-discrimination and equal opportunity in their place. And Section 504 is probably the most well-known, and you'll probably find people, and actually I'll refer to the Rehabilitation Act as Section 504 from here on out, because it is the section that spells out all the different rights for education and employment, not only for adults but also children with disabilities, including equal opportunity, full participation, which means that any government-funded institution that provides any sort of civil service or any sort of outside activities, for example, even a school corporation, and participation in their sports teams, A student cannot be excluded from that based on their disability, nor can any adult be excluded from any public event based on their disability. And Section 508, which was very far ahead of its time, talked about accessibility for public technology. Now this includes libraries, not only public libraries but also university campus libraries. Aside from buying electronic typewriters and things, they are now expected to get certain assistive technologies, such as Perkins Braillers, which are miniature typewriters which have the 6 buttons which can combine to make any of the letters in Braille, and things such as closed-circuit televisions for the visually impaired, which is basically a monitor hooked up to a camera, which can then magnify print up to a viable size for someone with a visual impairment to use. And basically all of this in the efforts to give the most access possible for people with disabilities to fully experience everything that this society had to offer them. Now 2 years later, we see this sort of legislation come down into the K through 12 schools in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, also known as Public Law 94-142. It came and was signed in 1975, and it mandated a free and appropriate public education for all students in the least restrictive environment. Now what that means is that before, schools were able to refuse service for certain students if they felt that their disabilities could not be met with the services that they had at the school. Well, what IDEA said is that you need to now bring those services to your school to meet the student, rather than have the student try to meet the needs of the school, providing more access, especially for students in areas where they would not otherwise be able to just pick up and go to a school that had the type of services that could help them. Also, IDEA protects students until the age of 22, so, well, this may be a K through 12 piece of legislation. We as adult educators may very well end up in instances where we are teaching students who are protected by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. I mean, with the dropout age being 16, it would be pretty viable for APS's definition of a returning student being out of school for 3 years. It would be certainly feasible to see a 20-year-old person come back into an alternative school and try to finish up his high school degree. Well, he would be covered under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act if he was in fact classified as eligible for services under this piece of legislation. And the other good thing about IDEA was it created a certain sense of long-term planning for students, whereas they're going to need to do something after high school, and it's very vocational oriented. And at the age of 14, the teacher, along with counselors and let's say an associate from vocational rehabilitation, would come and meet, and they would start to form a transition plan for any student found eligible to receive services through IDEA, where they go through different skills sets, ability sets, as far as independent living needs, and with 4 years notice begin to build a plan that can be implemented once a student leaves high school and can enter independent life pretty smoothly, at least if it's done well. Now 15 years later, we saw what was a very well publicized piece of legislation, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now I'm not so sure if it's still current, but at the time it was the largest bill signing ceremony in the lawn of the White House ever. Now what Americans with Disabilities Act did was not only affirm everything in the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, but it also had its own particular focuses. Where 504 leaves off with access to both education and employment, ADA picks up with access to different public settings, such as buildings, public transportation, public activities, telecommunications, and different public facilities and services. Now, in a telecommunication, what that means is that, for example, any person who is hard of hearing or deaf is now able to use a TTD or TTY or a caption telephone service where either a relay operator or some sort of automated machine takes in phone calls and produces text so that the person can then read and more easily converse with people using somewhat of a non-restrictive method. I mean, being the phone, at least at the time of the legislation, I mean, the phone was still pretty widely used, or at least the landline phones. And as far as public facilities and services, I mean, ADA has actually caught quite a bit of flack for some of the sweeping powers that it seems to bear, and the courts have ruled both ways on access to public facilities and services, whereas a lot of the opponents to ADA would be, let's say, small business owners who would have to put down some sort of substantial amount of their capital to be able to fully make their facility ADA compliant. And then sometimes you get these kind of like hotshot like ADA advocates. They come in and they write up, you know, half the companies in the town on different violations just because if you get a building that's going to be older than about 30 years old, it's going to be very hard to go through the building and not find some sort of non-compliance, at least if it hasn't been upgraded after this date. So, I mean, while ADA in and of itself is good, it has been used for, I suppose frivolous would be an okay word. I mean, somewhat frivolous purposes, and I mean, even go as far as to say some money-grubbing opportunities. But for the little bit that ADA is misused, it far outweighs all the bad with the good, as far as reaching out and providing access in telecommunication, on the internet, and providing accessibility in public transportation. Nowadays, anytime you see a public bus, most of them will be equipped with somewhat of a pneumatic chairlift, where a person with a mobility impairment can ride normal bus lines without any problems. I mean, you know, anything that we can do to provide a less restrictive environment, whereas we can make people more free to be more self-determined and live ultimately better lives. And lastly, ADA does not overrule or supersede Section 504. That's Title V of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Well, while they do not override each other, they work together. And what ADA meant as somewhat of a catch-all, where maybe you couldn't specifically cite 504 in as some sort of litigation, let's say against like a private institution that had the means but was not providing ADA compliant facilities or services or something along those lines. So now that we've looked at the three pieces of disability legislation, I'd like to look at some of the implications for us as adult educators. And to say that there was one answer to this question would be somewhat short-sighted, because I mean, different adult education settings fall under different legislation. So we have to first ask ourselves, what is it that we're doing? And after we define ourselves, we can then go and see what legislation is going to be affecting us, and then we can go and see what we can do. For those of us that are teaching in public institutions, these are colleges, universities, community colleges, Also, some workforce development offices and other civil service offices. These agencies are covered under both Sections 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, they're covered under the anti-discrimination clause under both of these rulings, but ADA also goes further into the access, such as the architectural barriers and other such like infrastructure compliance, whereas 504 is more based on equal opportunity, both in activities and in, let's say, even advancement within a certain sort of public setting. Now, corporate institutions are also covered under the two above pieces of legislation, mostly for the same reasons. Section 504 covers both non-discrimination, affirmative action, and equal opportunity, while ADA covers a lot of the access issues in the building. Now, private institutions aren't necessarily covered under Section 504. Well, why is that? It's because private institutions, at least in the definition that I'll use for this presentation, are ones that don't receive any federal money. Institutions that don't receive federal funding do not fall under the umbrella of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. They do, however, fall under the umbrella of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Therefore, they need to provide fully accessible, fully participatory facilities and services for all of their patrons, including those with disabilities. And if they cannot do that, this is where a lot of some of the lawsuits get a little bit hairy, because what they have to do, they need to look, what ends up happening is the judge or whoever is the mediator looks at the books for the business, and they do somewhat of a feasibility analysis where they say, okay, well, with this sort of capital coming in, it's feasible that they could spend X amount of dollars on ADA compliance a year. And if they are in fact doing that, just because, let's say, there is a doorway that wasn't 32 inches, that might be overlooked because they are, in essence, doing what they can, if you will, to help meet these compliance issues. Now, local education agencies, or LEAs, are any school corporation that do K through 12 special education services. This is the one specific agency that is under the umbrella of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This is strictly a K through 12 piece of legislation that provides a pretty large umbrella of both protection and services for students that qualify under the 13 categories of disability that they have at the current moment. And that's after an evaluation process and the whole 9 yards, basically. So let's look at our responsibilities as adult educators regarding disabled students. And the first thing that I think is really important when we're working and teaching students with disabilities is that we need to have an open, honest, and also on the level lines of communications. What we need to do is at the very beginning, we need to build rapport with these students by asking. We need to sit down and talk with them and say, tell me about you, and so I can tell me everything that I need to know to help you. And I mean, you'd be surprised how often that happens. It's not a very prevalent practice, and it surprises me, especially in today's age of what seems pretty acute disability awareness. And sometimes, just the real, naivety and absence of sense sometimes when dealing with students that have disabilities, it just kind of boggles my mind a little bit. So effective communication is definitely the number one thing, responsibility that we have as adult educators to provide a successful environment. Number two is developing good curriculum. And we want to ask ourselves, am I providing diverse learning styles? And not only diverse learning styles, but learning opportunities, especially for students with a specific disability. This might not be um, a visible disability. This may be a specific learning disability, or maybe any other sort of internal non-visible disability. It might affect how people learn in a certain way. I mean, it would be pretty obvious to say that people with visual impairments would be more auditorily inclined, and somewhat conversely, someone who is deaf or hard of hearing would be relatively visual learner. Well, I mean, that in fact is true, but what we're seeing is we see a large jump in the identifications of specific learning disabilities, and the more that we learn about the brain and the more we're able to test the minds of kids, the more specific learning shortfalls we're going to find, and we're going to have to then intervene for. So the more learning styles and learning opportunities that we provide in the class, that's the more opportunity for the really engaged, gainful learning to happen, because we're going to be matching up a learning opportunity with a learning style that is a strength for the student. We're going to talk about confidentiality, and this is something I believe that it's much more paid attention to in the K through 12 system than it is in higher adult and community education. What we need to do as adult education, or as adult educators, is that we need to provide a safe, discrete, private environment for a student to disclose his or her medical information to you. There's plenty of times, even as my time as an undergrad at Ball State, where at the end of the first class, after reading the ADA statement, you have, let's say, a student come up, and they would be holding the disability disclosure paperwork from the Disabled Student Services office, and all of a sudden, they would be getting like the third degree in the middle of the class while everyone's still packing up and leaving about, and pretty private, personal medical issues, things that I would not personally feel comfortable talking about with anyone present, let alone a whole class full of kids walking out. So it's really important to maintain confidentiality. Not only from a professional standpoint, but from a legal standpoint, because disclosure of medical disability or any sort of disability to a university qualifies it as protected information. Any information we give to the university is protected by the university and can't really be released. And there's other legislation, such as FERPA, that helps protect the security of that information. So it's just something. Just don't get into bad habits when dealing with sensitive information with students. Keep it private, keep it discreet, keep it between you and the person. Lastly, we need to provide promised services. Now, depending on what legislation a student's covered under, they are afforded terminology, and most of them is something along the lines of reasonable accommodations. And for more formal settings, those are usually spelled out for you. For example, in colleges, universities, K through 12 settings, all of this is all documented in a database, and papers are sent out to the instructors informing them not only of the student's presence, but also the approved accommodations that have gone through the proper due process channels within the institution and have been otherwise approved. Now, in informal settings where you might not necessarily owe someone, at least legally, owe someone reasonable accommodations. Even in something informal as, let's say, being a guitar teacher for someone with a visual impairment, you really need to make sure to have all of the sheet music put into a proper format, blown up to a size that the student's learning wouldn't be impacted. I mean, maybe if it wouldn't be, per se, a violation of any sort of law. If you went to a teacher and you were supposed to learn something and you didn't really learn at the rate that you wanted to, it's not really a good way to get return business. So I mean, even in the informal settings, providing the most least restrictive environment, providing just a positive, comfortable environment, proactive environment for students, all students, honestly, is just the way to go, really. Let's talk a little bit about communication. We talked about this a little bit earlier, where we need to have students explain their needs in detail. They need to say, I have, this. Having this means that it's like I have a hard time walking past, let's say like a 3/4 of a mile or a mile, so I'm going to need to be able to have access to transportation. Also, this affects me in this way, so I'm going to need this. And it goes on this and forth and back and forth, and it's a conversation that you have between you and the student. And at the end, I mean, not only do you know, specifically what to do to help the student out, I think you've probably also gone a long way to build rapport and to start a positive, productive learning relationship with the student. And one of the things I think is important is that positive teacher-student relationship. And if you're sending positivity, even just through your inquiry, that's going to be something positive that the student will feed off of. You need to ask for feedback about accommodations. What that means is like, okay, I'm going to make sure that your tests are at 18-point font every time, or else I make sure that your tests are okay so you can read them. So you hand them the first test, then afterwards, they come by the office to office hours, and you say, hey, how did it go? It's like, was it big enough? Was it too big? Was this okay? And this sort of thing, it's like we were talking about before. It really does a lot to build trust, to build rapport, to build that relationship between you and the student. They're going to trust you more, they're going to work with you more, they're going to be able to open up with you more, ultimately be more successful. Now, not something it would not be a good idea to do is, even back under the umbrella of confidentiality, to go, let's say everyone's getting there and it's like, hey, when class is starting, it's like, was that test big enough? It's like, could you see that okay? It would be probably a pretty embarrassing experience for the student. Not only being kind of put on the spot, but also kind of being disclosed to the whole world as having a disability. I would assume it would be his or her personal decision of whether or not he would like to disclose that to his classmates or not. So, like I said, maintain confidentiality while you're maintaining good communication. You need to inform students of downward trends and offer advice. Now, this is important because as soon as you start to see this pattern of downward performance, what we need to do is we need to pull the person aside and say, okay, well, let's try and find an answer to why this is happening and work on it. And to be honest, it's really not anything different than we would do with a normal student, and that's true, and that's a good point, and it's a point that I'm going to get to here in just a couple slides. Now, one thing you also want to avoid is over-communication, along with disclosing a student's disability in front of the whole class. Maintaining a certain attitude of mutual respect is also a good thing too. You probably see it more, honestly, with more younger students. But patronization is something that happens. Even at even at high levels, and this especially happens. And I've actually talked to people in the cerebral palsy community, and this is probably their #1 complaint, because it's like cerebral palsy is a neurological disorder. It's not a mental disorder. I suppose it could be classified as a physical disability, but it's really neurological. People with more severe cerebral palsy are oftentimes mistaken for having some sort of mental handicap because they're not able to manipulate the muscles that they need to make kind of cogent and coherent audible sounds for speech. But what people don't realize is that, I mean, that's a neurological deficiency, whereas if they could just move their muscles right, what would come out of their mouth would be anything that would come out of anyone with a normal level of intelligence. Because, I mean, these people are often tested at normal intelligence, but it's their neurological, their neurological problems. As far as like from outward appearances, it shows a lot more than certain disabilities and certain disorders, and it's really easy for people to mistake one for the other. And I mean, I had friends that I had from high school and college, and it's like, I mean, they're really not. They're really just the same as anybody else. You don't need to. You don't need to give them undue praise. I mean, and they didn't, well, nor do they want it. They just want the same type of respect as anybody else. And it's going to be a recurring theme in this presentation. It's like, what's good for serving people with disabilities is often good for everybody. Let's talk about developing curriculum a little bit. What we need to do is we need to understand the needs and learning styles, strengths of students when planning activities. If we know that we have a majorly visual audience, we know that we can put mainly visual components. That being said, if we know that we have a really strong kinesthetic person, I mean, we need to take those opportunities to provide those activities that are going to allow them to learn tactily and receive the most gainful, meaningful learning for the time that they spend with you. And see, in group learning can foster better social interaction between classmates, and I think that, I mean, we've had a great example in our class. And just being able to work with each other and to learn what we come from in our ideas, and to be able to, I mean, not necessarily even in mixed ability groupings, but the more that students with disabilities are able to interact with their non-disabled peers, it's a not only positive but also a normal social outlet that they should be provided. I mean, there's no reason not to. Also, techniques and resources that are helpful for students with disabilities often are also helpful for students without disabilities. Now, this is getting into the universal design of learning theory that we're going to get to in just a second, but it's very true. Just because there's, especially in today's age of assistive technology, it would just be it's oftentimes more convenient to when you're on the go have things such as audiobooks read to you. Well, I'm saying, well, we can do that now. We can have our textbooks scanned in, and with a program called Kurzweil, we can then have that text read to us, and once it gets to the point where we can put it onto a portable device such as like an iPhone or an Android phone, you'll literally be able to download the book to your phone and have it, just grab it and go, and it would almost replace modern day audio books, because you would just have the book and it would get scanned in, and you'd be able to use it. What was meant for someone who is blind or visually impaired could really be good for everybody, and I mean, there's a million examples of that. Okay, we talked a little bit about confidentiality. It's especially important in formal settings because, I mean, HR is a stickler about that. IDEA, I mean, confidentiality in the K through 12 with FERPA and everything. I mean, that's serious stuff. We need to maintain information that we know about students. We need to keep it personal. Disability disclosure forms are for the instructor's eyes only. K through 12, those are also known as IEPs. In more formal adult education settings, They might have a disability services office that provides teachers with these letters just as a heads up and as a resource for them to use. And I mean, something that you wouldn't want to leave laying out on your desk when you have kids coming in and out, and they can glance over and read it. And we also want to refrain about talking about disclosed information in a public setting, such as, right after class, or right in the beginning of class, or whenever there's anyone around. Really, it's not just you and the person in your office. It's a no-no. Provision of services. Once again, it's more rigid in formal settings. The IEP is very straightforward. It says you need to provide these services. He needs this kind of therapy, this many minutes a week. That's that, and it's protected by law. It's the same way in college as far as the reasonable accommodations that are approved for a student. If a teacher does not provide services for a student in a college setting, they have legal recourse through Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Approved accommodations are on file with the institution, so it's not like they're going to be able to, let's say, pull a fast one over on you, because if they say that they have certain accommodations, there's safeguards in place. You can go check. You can make sure to maintain not only the services that the students deserve, but you can maintain the validity and the integrity of your class too, which is important. Services should be provided both constantly and discreetly. It's not going to help someone, to get their papers enlarged 60% of the time. I mean, it'll help out 60% of the time, but if a student can't come into a class and just know that he'll be able to have his resources in a way that he can use them, I mean, what kind of attitude would you have if you went into a class and didn't know that you wouldn't have the resources to be able to learn? I mean, it wouldn't be positive. So, and also discreetly, let's say, if there's someone that's taking notes for a student in class, or if the teacher is providing notes to the student, it wouldn't be appropriate to come in halfway through the class and it's like, oh yeah, well, hey, I forgot to print off those notes for you. I mean, of course, then, everyone's sitting around you. It's like, well, why is he getting notes? It's something that disclosure of disability is between the instructor and the student, and that's it. Don't let it be anything else. Now, we're accommodating returning adults. This is where UDL really starts to come into play. Things that we use for helping students with disabilities, we can also help to accommodate returning, potentially aging adults returning to college and university settings. There's lots of physical discrepancies between a normal age college student and, let's say, a returning college student of 40 or 50. I mean, such things include health, such as eyesight and hearing, capacity for learning. Extended absence may leave students weak in specific learning styles. So if they go in and it's like, oh, I can't stand this lecture classes, and then you don't practice it for a while, in your absence you will not get better. Your skills will deteriorate. So something you're already weak at, you become extremely weak at, and it becomes very hard to recover from that without some sort of system of support. And also motivation. One of the things that we are learning in 631 is that we need to make learning as practical to returning students as possible. The returning students are very career-oriented. They're there to get their certification or educational advancement to go out and get a better job. They want everything that they're learning to be relevant with what they're going to do after they get their piece of paper and go out and get a job. And if you're not doing that, you're not going to get the same level of engagement, motivation, or effect out of your students, it wouldn't be optimal. So let's talk a little bit about universal design theory. Now, this began as a movement of the architectural field in the 1990s, and it's due to the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, ADA called for all buildings to be built handicap accessible. And while architects were designing new buildings that were handicap accessible, they also saw certain trends in providing these accessible resources in the form of a building, and they saw real-world general population benefits to these things. For example, curb cuts were things that people fought for in the 70s and 80s. I mean, hard, people in wheelchairs, I mean, you can't get up and down the curb when there's not a curb cut there. They put it there and people complained. And now, I mean, when you see, let's say, even out on the scramble light on campus, I mean, you see people with strollers, with the wheelie backpacks, I mean, even on rollerblades and skateboards, and I mean, they're able to go up and down those little corners without having to hurdle a curb, I mean, just as easily as someone in a wheelchair can cross the street and get to class. That which was designed to help someone with disabilities has helped everybody, helped the community at large, or benefited it at least. Services provided to students with disabilities are also helpful for non-disabled students. So this is kind of a repeating theme in the universal design theory. You have to think about specific interventions that we use over here. Can we use them over here? So then, I mean, it kind of changes the role of an educator to being almost this font of resource and intervention. Aside from being that, also having the ability to execute it in several situations, several different situations, to achieve, I mean, similar outcomes. Now, multiple delivery methods, multiple types of activities, and learning is directly impacted by motivation and effect. These are the three main principles of universal design of learning. We want kinesthetic learning, auditory learning, visual learning. We want group activities. We want mixed ability groupings. We want same ability groupings. We want collaborative learning. We want independent learning. All these different avenues give students the best chance for success. And also, if a student is not motivated, if a student is not positively affected towards learning, the return on the time and the effort put in will not be as great as if they were more motivated and engaged. So the higher motivation, higher output. So let's talk a little bit about some UDL principles. Let's say vision accessibility. When we're writing things, when we're writing papers, an interesting thing to use as a UDL principle is to write all your papers and handouts at 14-point font. Now that might not sound like a big difference, but 14-point font is actually about 20% bigger than 12-point font. And I mean, that is getting up to the point of a half or a full magnitude of optical prescription. So I mean, that is significant. And I mean, if you could make something 20% easier to read by just hitting one button, it's like, would you do it? I mean, the next is provide access for presentation slides electronically. I think Ball State does a great job of this on Blackboard. I mean, not only would this help someone who have a hard time seeing the board, it'd help anyone that just wants to follow along and take the little notes in the PowerPoint on the comment little tab and go home and be able to study off of it and not have to read through little scribblings on their notepad and have to go back and forth. And it's just a more effective way for learning for everybody, even though perhaps it was designed for one, it was good for everybody. Also, when you can set up classrooms with seats significantly closer to the board or the projector, there's people that like those. The horseshoe setup, I mean, well, I don't personally have anything against it. I think you're missing out on a lot of prime real estate in the front of the room for kids that really need to be close, or students that need to be close. Whether it be hearing, whether it be seeing, whether it be, I mean, ADD, where you just don't want to have all this activity going on around you and you just want to be able to be in front. There needs to be, I mean, at least my idea of UDL is that you should be able to have as many seats available as close to the front as possible, and especially for the aging students. Now, I mean, for hearing, it's almost the same thing. Many of these classrooms now come with lecture microphones, and I mean, most of the time they sit with the power off. Well, My first suggestion would be to always use the lectern microphones. I mean, you don't have to blow people's ears out with the noise, but even just amplifying your voice 50% would make something 50% easier to hear for someone with bad hearing, and that can make the difference between fading in and out and being able to pay attention during the entire class period. So always use closed captioning when viewing films. Now see, from even though I can hear fine, some of those projectors in those halls, they sound like the Peanuts parents, where you can't really understand anything that they're saying. So it's like I actually like it better when closed captioning is on, because I like to, when you can't sometimes hear what they're saying just because of the poor quality of the speaker, you can at least get helped out a little bit by the closed captioning. So, hey, while the closed captioning would obviously be good for someone who couldn't hear, it'd be good for anyone else who just is fed up with that speaker that's not any good. And also, provide, just like previously, provide seats within close proximity to the instructor so you can hear easier. Now, mobility accessibility. This is an interesting point on two different points. One, from wheelchair-bound students, and two, addressing the medical obesity epidemic in America. I forget what the statistics are, but it's something around 20 to 30% of Americans being either obese or like really obese. I'm not so sure what it is, but the number one thing that I see in a lot of college classrooms is seats that are attached to desks. And for people of normal size and of normal mobility, that's not a problem. For someone in a wheelchair, it's a problem, because just transferring in and out of a chair sometimes can be a very not only a complicated, but in front of a crowd of people, it could be a very humbling and embarrassing experience for someone. And something that I would recommend is to use desks with unattached seats, if you can find them. Not only would someone in a wheelchair be able to roll under it and be able to use it at a normal height, someone with any sort of bariatric issue could also have the extra room that would make learning not in a can of sardines a little bit more comfortable. And provide both practical and unobtrusive seating arrangements for students in wheelchairs. Now, this is somewhat of a point that I've seen in my practice, where I've seen a lot of teachers put a student in a wheelchair almost like front and center, or front and off to the right. And I like sitting kind of in the front, kind of close to the door. So I'm usually in the front, and there's been a couple classes where the student in the wheelchair was like directly in front of, it was like eclipsing the projector from where I was sitting, and I felt awkward being like, hey, I'm really sorry, but you're like right there, and even I can move over a little bit if you can move over a little bit, but it's like, just can we just place people a little bit more, like, not unobtrusively, so it's just not not only would it be better for the people that have to sit behind and around, but it'd also be a little less it would be a little more comfortable not to just be singled out front and center like that. And if you just be able to have a desk right maybe in the corner of a row or something that you could just come in and be able to access normally, any additional facets of normalcy you can provide to an educational experience is good. So let's wrap this up a little bit. And what are 4 things that we can take away from teaching adults with disabilities? Number 1, we need to know the laws. We need to go, and if you haven't look at least, if you're interested in teaching in a college or university, look at Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and see some of the protected rights that people with disabilities have. It's just good information to know. Along with all the due process jargon that only a few people need to know, some of the general principles in there are pretty beneficial for people that want to teach in adult education settings, they will inevitably deal with students with disabilities, so it'd be good to know about them. Number 2, be proactive instead of reactive. What we want to do is we need to constantly be thinking how we can make stuff better, rather than have even though we might not always have the luxury, if we can avoid a bad decision by forward planning rather than react to a bad situation after it happens, we should do that if at all possible. And I mean, it can't always happen, but it can happen sometimes, and the more that we can make it happen, the better it'll be. So number 3, have common sense. And it's like, it's really, it may sound overly simple, but common sense can be at a premium sometimes. Is just treat others, the way you would want to be treated, and you'd have to think. It's like, if I had this sort of problems, put their shoes on and walk around. Just reflect for an hour and say, if I had a severe mobility impairment, I can walk around. What kind of things would I need to be able to be successful in this same situation as my student? And I mean, the more that you put yourself in other people's situations, you'd be surprised what you would learn. And last things is we need to strive to meet UDL ideologies. Basically, we need to learn things that are good to help intervene for people with disabilities. We also need to know how to apply those in more general aspects and general settings, so that not only can we help the 1% of people that do actually have the specific disability that this intervention is tailored for, but we can maybe help another 30 or 40% of the general public that would benefit just from being able to have this as an extra resource. I mean, maybe not even as a rehabilitation or a remediation tool. It might just be a convenience. For example, even Siri, the iPhone 4S voice, it's just a further development of the voice recognition system in Kurzweil, which was developed for blind and visually impaired people to be able to read text or read print, or be able to hear it. It would translate the text into a synthesized voice, kind of like what Siri can do on the iPhone now. So what was being used by blind people in the 70s is now being used by anyone with an iPhone 4S now. So you think about the thousands of % increase of people that are actually using something that is, in essence, a universal design tool. So in closing, I hope that you were able to learn a little bit about the different pieces of legislative policy in regards to disability policy and adult education. I hope you were able to learn a little bit about what to do in certain situations and how to be a more effective educator of adults with disabilities. I hope you learned a little bit about how the aging returning student could also benefit from certain interventions that we provide for people with disabilities. And I hope that you learned a lot about the universal design of learning theory, and I hope that you take that and apply it to your own practice to be the best educator that you can. So for edX 631, Final Focus on Disability Policy and Adult Education, this is Nicholas Baumgartner. Thank you for listening, and have a good night.